Hey guys, so of course we haven't had any YCS events post New Balance, but at the very least we did have 1 weekend worth of regional, so I thought I'd just go through the available list and just map out the most played hand traps and staples as usual as you prepare for your events coming up this format. So before we begin, definitely a huge shout out to all my sponsors. Go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh singles or supplies. Now, I also definitely want to highlight Ivan and Renren from YGOProDeck.com again, just because of their amazing work keeping track of all these topping deck lists, which definitely helps me in terms of, for me to go through all those lists and just map out these hand traps and staples. Now, in terms of the topping deck lists that were included for this video, so I was able to include 61 lists from regional tops all across the TCG globe. So we do mostly have Rescue Ace, pretty good chunk of like Labrynth and different Fire King variants, and by variants I mean, it could be like also Tri Brigade Fire King, or even like, let's say, PAX winning Fire King Rescue Ace deck list for example. So that's really cool. Some Mannadium and Cashier sprinkled in there as well. So just keep in mind that, in terms of like the most played hand traps or even staples, sometimes they can be influenced by the kind of decks that are included for this kind of analysis, right? Just because, let's say, Cashier is a good example with, like, let's say, Dimension Shifter, where only certain decks can play Shifter, but if, there's a lot of Cashier decks in, like, Top Cut, then you would also see a lot of Shifter in terms of the representation, but at the same time, it's not actually a hand trap that, most decks can play, for example. Now, in terms of an overview of hand traps, speaking of that, we actually have a median of 9 hand traps in the mean, which is actually the same as what we saw last month with YCS Bologna coverage. And so if you actually also saw my video that I did just before the end of 2023, I basically did a trend overview of, like the hand traps and also staples for the entire year. And you actually saw we're kind of in like the higher end in terms of, median number of hand traps. But this is actually the exact same as last month at least. And same thing for the side. Median number of hand traps is 6, which is what we saw at YCS Bologna. And also for going second board breakers, median was 3 in the main, which again was the same as in Bologna. And actually even the board breakers in the side at 5 was also the same. So despite this new ban list, yes, of course, some decks have taken notable hits, like let's say, Tearlaments and Unchained. They have sort of fallen out of rotation, although not as much for Tearlaments, it looks like, at least so far. And so despite those changes in the format, I think in terms of overall number of, the kind of hand traps and board breakers you play, probably hasn't actually changed too much. So now, speaking of hand traps, let's just cover the most played in the topping deck lists that were at least publicly available, and Ash does reclaim its throne as number 1. Of course, Ash is good, it's very generic. I think maybe this partly has to do with just the fact that, it's the first weekend of the new format. Maybe players were playing it safe because Ash is usually like the safest hand trap to really play and include in your deck list. I mean, we do still have Rescue Ace as like one of the best, if not the best, at least right now. And Ash is, of course, good on Emergency. Against Fire Kings, there's several ways to hit them with. Of course, it's not like super high impact, but of course we also have Labrynth as well, which Ash is going to be good. And something like Branded, they didn't get hit on the ban list, and Ash on Branded Fusion is also quite painful, and I would know. We do still have Droll here, and so of course Mannadium did not get hit on that ban list. I don't know why, considering all the other hits the different decks got, but you do still have to kind of have Droll in your back pocket. Mostly sided, it looks like, if it was played, because to keep those decks like Mannadium in check, because otherwise they are very dangerous if they are left to go first. We do have Imperm. Again, this is probably one of the more like safer choices I can typically always include in almost every format. There's only ever been like really one bad format I can think of where Imperm was not good, and that was during that VFD virtual format. But other than that time, I think Imperm has honestly seen a high amount of play. Even during that tier 0 format, this was the only quote-unquote traditional hand trap that actually saw a good amount of play even during those times. We have Nib also seeing a lot of play. This has been the case the last couple months as well. Kind of the slightly interesting part is that, even when Nib is usually played a lot, it's at least like kind of sees a lot of main deck play. But this time around, it's actually, mostly side deck, but still played enough because, you do have to respect some decks out there. Of course, Rescue Ace being able to tribute off before they can set 5 usually is ideal if they cannot play around it. This is a new one. We do have Ghost Spell kind of rising up the ranks lately. This was kind of predictable, I think, because this is good against Fire King. They do tend to kind of recur from the graveyard. And again, while we don't have transaction rollback legal yet, it will be next week. And of course, just kind of preparing for Labrynth because they did not get hit in any fashion in that ban list. And, Ash and Bell against them are really strong, on the welcome / big welcome, really critical in stopping them down. Then we also have effect failure. So of course, I should have spoken this about Imperm, but you know, effect negation is still important because of Rescue Ace set 4. Veiler, I mean, it's still seeing a pretty good chunk of play, but I guess, let's say something like Purrely did get hit on that ban list, while not huge, but still, you know, a notable hit. And of course, they're also a deck that were likely to play Veiler just because they tend to draw on the opponent's turn, and drawing Veiler is a lot better than drawing Imperm in those instances. So maybe that might have a little bit of a reason for it to be lower than it might otherwise have if Purrely was still around, as at least tier 1-ish. We still have Bestials, of course. I'm just using Druid's Room as an image because it was played more. Magma was seen in like 14 lists, but you know, you do also have some decent popularity of that Bestial Runic deck still going around, something that of course Joshua Schmidt won YCS Bologna with. And I actually also recently did a profile with a Montreal Regionals winning list, which is also Bestial Runic, and so they are still here to stay. Of course, you know, Fire King, let's say Rescue Ace, they are fire, so Bestials aren't really going to come up against them, but something like Labrynth, which again, after transaction rollback is legal, they are going to be quite the force to deal with, and Bestials are very good against Labrynth as well. And then we have DD Crow, which is, you know, similar to Bestials, but I guess maybe not played as much. For one hand, you know, I did talk about tier elements kind of falling out of the mix, at least in the tier 1 conversation. Purrely also got a bit of a hit, and at least Crow had some form of impact. Of course, it can be useful against Fire Kings, but I guess they kind of shifted towards playing Ghost Spell more instead, just because of its impact on Labrynth as well. But, you know, who knows? I'm sure DD Crow is still going to stick around for now. We do have Shifter. I kind of spoke about this earlier. We only had like 5 Chimera lists, for example, so they're obviously going to play Shifter. I don't think you're really seeing the case like before, where we had things like, you know, let's say Rescue Ace or Purrely playing Shifter in the side, even though they don't play that well under it, but they do play it better than tier lists, for example, and that's why they sided it. I don't think we're really in that situation anymore, especially with tier kind of being out of that tier 1 conversation. But of course, you know, something like Floowandereeze and Chimera, those decks are obviously the main prime suspects for playing Shifter. And then we lastly have Phantasme, which doesn't see like a huge amount of play, but definitely I noticed this in like a Bestial Runic list as well. Just being able to draw into something like, you know, Nib or let's say Droll, it can be really, really strong. And that targeting protection can actually be pretty useful as well, especially in this format. Let's say with, of course, we have a lot of Imperm, but you know, something like, let's say Rescue Ace, all their back row interruptions, like they do target as well. And now moving on to the side deck staples, we do have Feather Duster, nothing too much to say. I mean, against Fire King though, it's not that amazing because their field spell is usually protected by the continuous spell. But you know what, like pretty much in every other situation, it's going to have some form of use, like especially Rescue Ace. They do set 5, that's kind of nice, or rather set 4. Call by the Grave, this has actually gone quite a lot compared to the last few months. Trying to understand why. Maybe because I guess going second against Fire Kings, it can actually come up and it's a lot more than, you know, just trying to stop hand traps, for example. Or maybe it's just also a matter of like a new format, playing some, you know, safe choice cards. But you know, usually the last few months, Call by the Grave has actually seen quite a decline in terms of play, at least at the YCS topping level. Cosmic Cyclone is another one. I think I did mention in the last month breakdown that I suspect this would go up more with something like, let's say, like, of course, you have, you know, Labrynth still in the mix, and being able to banish the back row, even if they get to resolve it, it's still kind of decent, right? So they don't get to recur it. But also something like Fire King, this can potentially come up. I mentioned about that field spell being protected at least by card destruction. You can banish it, and then it does blow up their field, which in some cases can help them from what I understand, but you know what, sometimes it can still be good. You also have Talents, which again, wasn't hit on the ban list or anything. It's really strong. Usually you do see Thrust hand in hand with this, but nowadays not as much lately in the last couple of months, which is kind of interesting. You also have Fenrir, which of course, very strong card. We do have 5 Chimera lists included here, so you do have to keep that in mind. That's kind of like one of their main engine pieces to begin with. But even then, non-Chimera decks still playing it really strong, going first or second. We do have Pankta 2 now, but you know, Fenrir probably better in a lot of different contexts at least. Next, we have Evenly Matched, which is also kind of interesting to me because the last month at YCS Bologna, this actually saw a really big decline in play. I mean, I assume because something like SP, when they just banish their own monsters and they kind of come back, they are able to recover from something like Evenly Matched quite well. And I don't know, in my personal experience, it didn't really seem that great against Fire Kings anyways. Someone correct me if I'm wrong there. So, I mean, again, maybe it partly has to do with like being like a safe choice as you start the new format. Maybe I'm missing something here, but Evenly nonetheless, you know, against a lot of boards, I guess, can be potentially useful. And then we have Lightning Storm, again, just generic board wipe against something like Rescues can be very useful. Lightning Storm has been actually quite popular for the last few months, especially kind of funny that once it got semi-limited, I feel like it actually saw more play. Actually, it did, which is kind of interesting. We also have Pancratops, which recently came back to 2, so it's, you know, decent amount of play, I guess. Not in a majority of the lists or anything, definitely not seeing as much play as something like Fenrir, at least, even accounting for the fact that, you know, Cashier decks are, of course, playing Fenrir, but still really cool to see this come back to 2. And it is very, very versatile. Next we have Super Poly, which of course we do have several branded lists that topped and are included in this video. They are likely to play Super Poly because they can play better than most decks, right? It's not just the generic extra deck targets that they play, but, you know, usually like Dark or Light plus, you know, Despia Monster, for example. That's an example for how Super Poly can be very useful for them. But, you know, outside of those decks, it's still seeing some play. Of course, Fire Kings, they are fire, so, you know, it's going to come up as well. You also have Thrust. We did kind of briefly touch on this, how it's not seeing as much play as it was the last like maybe like a few months ago, which usually saw play hand in hand with talents. So I'm not sure if there's really a good reason for that. I don't think it's necessarily bad or it's gotten worse. Maybe it has to just do with some of the topping decks that just don't really need or rather maybe don't make as much use out of Thrust. I'm not really sure, but that is kind of interesting in the last month or so. We also have Destructive Daruma Cannon. The 7 deck lists that were remaining, I believe, were just all Labrynth, the 7 that were included for this video. But you know what? There were a few deck lists outside of Labrynth that were citing it. It's typically a pretty a popular Thrust target outside of something like D-Barrier and Eradicator. Speaking of D-Barrier, I guess it's still here. Again, 7 of those will be from Labrynth, including the one that main decked it. But for the most part, hopefully it doesn't see that much play. I don't really like this card. I thought, or at least I was hoping it would finally get banned, but it does survive yet again. You also have Droplets. This has really been rather disappointing in terms of representation, I think, post the Rise Art ban. It really has not seen that much play, even though year before, in 2022, it actually saw a very huge amount of play at one point, being one of the most, or rather the most played staple, but definitely has not had its year in 2023 and so far in 2024. We have Solemn Judgment, kind of generic for especially decks that lack an Omni Negate, nothing too much to say there. And Book of Moon actually saw a little bit of play as well. Of course, you did have some hit to like Purrely. You know, I guess Chimera is kind of sort of back, at least at like a tier 2 level, probably. But you know what, Book of Moon is usually pretty flexible, and especially just being able to dodge like Imperm or Veiler, like those kind of targeting monster negates. Now, to cover just some of the more generic extra deck monsters that were played the most, as you can guess, the most played is, of course, SP Little Knight. But you know what? Not every list we're playing. I remember, like, at least at the YCS level, the very first event where SP was legal, every deck list except for one was playing SP. For regional level, I'm sure there's a bit more leniency, especially some people still actually playing on a budget as well, because it's not like at that YCS level. So, you know what? Have some hope if you don't have SP in your arsenal. Typhon, of course, is another popular choice lately. It's been second since I've started doing this. Which admittedly hasn't been for that long, but very, very strong card. And Dark has also been quite popular as well. I mean, usually this is probably going to be live, being able to revive like your opponent's Dark monster. IP Masquerena, this kind of makes the list for the first time. Usually goes hand in hand with SP now, compared to something like Nightmare Unicorn, which used to be its best partner in crime. And then, of course, Access Code Talker / Garura Tide. Of course, Access Code just being there for generic OTK kind of ending card. I was really hoping this would come in the Maze set. I thought it would have been a good time for that reprint, but I guess not. And then Garura, of course, as a super poly target, but usually, like for decks that have a flexible extra deck, they tend to play this because in case it does get sent to grave, they can at least draw one. And lastly, some tech choices, but not really, more so actually like just really old cards that were only seen in a small number of lists, and that is Vanity's Fiend, Soul Release, and Snack Shield. Again, very old cards, and you probably already know what they all do. So let's start with Vanity's Fiend, which essentially, you know, locks both players at a special summoning. This was cited in a Cashier deck list, basically, because, you know, they do have free bodies that they can summon out, and you can just, like, plop this at the end, try to lock your opponent out. I mean, I think, obviously, it can be strong. It kind of comes down to, draw the out, but there are definitely a lot of outs, but, you know what, can be really strong against a lot of strategies, at least. And, of course, Soul Release, this was seen in a side deck play, I believe in at least one Vanquish Soul list. I think this was for, like, the Fire King matchup, primarily, just, you know, getting rid of like Ponix or let's say like Runix. That's really strong, and so this is kind of cool too because this is a very old card. I still remember seeing this in like the anime as well, so I think it's kind of cool that, you know, these old cards see competitive play time and time again. And lastly, Snatch Steal, of course, recently got unbanned. Now the funny thing is, of course, I'm sure you know what it is, what it does rather, in terms of taking your opponent's monster. It did not see much play at all, only in like 1 or 2 lists. So while it did finally come back, it looks like, at least for now, there isn't much hype around this card. Obviously, something like Change of Heart can work better in a situation where, you know, you have something like Thrust to get into it, and realistically, if you're taking your opponent's monster, you're probably like linking it away anyway, so Change of Heart or Mind Control even would probably suffice, but I think it's still kind of cool that these cards did come back. Anyways, guys, that was it for the breakdown of the most played hand traps and staples so far in this first weekend of regionals. I also want to do more frequent regional top cut breakdown updates, something I haven't really done in quite some time, I guess. And so I think, you know, stay tuned. I'm also going to get a new camera soon, so I'm really excited for that. Definitely stay tuned for that update as well. So anyways, a huge thanks to all of you for watching. Huge thanks to my Patreons as always for the continued support as well. And well, take care, guys.